scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sun was shining through the yellow curtains, and everything seemed normal. Peppa stretched and yawned, ready for another fun day of jumping in muddy puddles. But when she looked over at George's bed, something was wrong. George was sitting up, but his eyes were completely black, staring at nothing. Peppa called out to him, but George didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned his head toward her, and his mouth opened in an impossibly wide smile, revealing rows of sharp, pointed teeth. His voice came out in a whisper that didn't sound like him at all. He kept repeating the same word over and over, but it wasn't dinosaur like usual. Frightened, Peppa ran downstairs to find Mummy and Daddy Pig. The living room looked the same as always, with its bright green walls and orange sofa, but the atmosphere felt heavy and wrong. Mummy Pig was standing in the kitchen, but she wasn't moving. She was just staring at the wall with that same black-eyed expression that George had. When Peppa approached her mother, Mummy Pig slowly turned around. Her usual warm smile had been replaced by something cold and mechanical. Her eyelashes seemed longer and darker, casting strange shadows across her face. She spoke in a voice that sounded like it was coming from far away, asking Peppa if she wanted to play a special game. Daddy Pig appeared from behind the newspaper he was reading, but his glasses reflected nothing but darkness. His beard seemed to move on its own, and when he laughed, it echoed through the house in a way that made Peppa's skin crawl. He suggested they all go to the playground, but the way he said it made it sound more like a command than a suggestion. At the playground, all of Peppa's friends were there, but they were different too. Susie Sheep stood motionless on the swings, her wool looking gray and matted. Pedro Pony was at the slide, but he wasn't sliding down. He was just standing at the top, looking down at Peppa with those same empty black eyes that everyone else had. The playground equipment itself seemed to have changed. The bright colors had faded to dull, sickly shades. The swings creaked even when no one was on them, and the seesaw moved up and down by itself. The sandbox was filled with something that definitely wasn't sand, something dark that seemed to shift and move when no one was looking directly at it. Rebecca Rabbit hopped over to Peppa, but her movements were jerky and unnatural. When she spoke, her voice had a strange echo, and she kept inviting Peppa to come play in the dark sandbox. All the other children began to gather around Peppa, forming a circle, their black eyes never blinking. Peppa tried to run, but everywhere she went, more familiar faces appeared with those same dark, empty eyes. The ice cream van played its melody, but the tune was wrong, distorted and haunting. Mr. Zebra the postman delivered letters that were completely black, and when they touched the ground, they seemed to absorb the light around them. The sky began to darken even though it was still morning. The sun seemed to be getting smaller and dimmer, and strange shadows started moving across the ground without anything to cast them. The trees in the park began to sway even though there was no wind, and their leaves rustled with sounds that almost seemed like whispers. Peppa found herself back at home, but the house had changed. The walls seemed taller and the rooms felt endless. Every mirror she passed showed not her reflection, but the black-eyed versions of her family and friends, all smiling those terrible sharp-toothed smiles. The photographs on the walls had changed too, showing scenes that Peppa didn't remember, with everyone's eyes replaced by dark voids. In the final moments, Peppa realized she was the only one left who hadn't changed. She looked in the bathroom mirror and saw her own familiar pink face and normal eyes looking back at her. But as she watched, her reflection began to smile that same impossible smile, and slowly, very slowly, her eyes began to turn black. The last thing Peppa heard was her own voice, but it wasn't coming from her mouth. It was coming from the mirror, inviting her to join the others in their special game. And as the darkness finally took her, she realized that this wasn't a nightmare at all. This was just the beginning of a very different kind of Peppa Pig world, where everyone would smile forever. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary evening when Peppa and George decided to play hide and seek in their house. The sun had set unusually early that day, casting long shadows through every window. Mummy Pig was in the kitchen preparing dinner, while Daddy Pig read his newspaper in the living room. Peppa counted to 10 with her eyes closed, standing in the hallway. When she opened them, the house felt different somehow. The familiar yellow walls seemed dimmer, and the cheerful family photos on the walls appeared to be watching her with their painted eyes. George had hidden somewhere upstairs, but as Peppa climbed the steps, each creak echoed louder than usual. The first place she checked was their bedroom. The bunk bed stood empty, but something was wrong with George's favorite dinosaur toy. It sat on the lower bunk, but its plastic eyes seemed to follow Peppa as she moved around the room. She called out for George, but only silence answered her back. Moving to the bathroom, Peppa noticed the mirror reflected something that wasn't quite right. For just a moment, she thought she saw George standing behind her, but when she turned around, nobody was there. The reflection showed only herself, yet she could hear George's giggle echoing from somewhere inside the mirror itself. Peppa searched the attic next, climbing the narrow stairs that led to the dusty storage space. Old boxes and forgotten toys created strange shapes in the darkness. Among them, she found George's second dinosaur, but this one was different. Its green plastic had turned gray, and tiny cracks ran across its surface like spider webs. Downstairs, Mummy Pig continued cooking, but her humming had taken on an odd, repetitive tune that Peppa had never heard before. The kitchen lights flickered occasionally, casting dancing shadows on the walls. When Peppa called to her mother, Mummy Pig turned around with a smile that seemed just a little too wide. Daddy Pig remained in his chair, but his newspaper rustled even though there was no wind in the house. The pages turned by themselves, revealing headlines that made no sense and pictures that seemed to move when Peppa wasn't looking directly at them. The search continued into the garden, where the familiar swing set and slide looked different under the strange twilight sky. The grass felt softer than usual, almost spongy beneath Peppa's feet. George's laughter seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Back inside the house, Peppa noticed that the family clock had stopped ticking. Its hands pointed to an impossible time, and its face seemed to watch her with mechanical eyes. The silence grew heavier with each passing moment. Finally, Peppa found George in the most obvious place of all, behind the living room curtains. But when she pulled the fabric aside, George looked different. His usual cheerful expression had been replaced by something more serious, more knowing. George told Peppa that he had been hiding in a place that wasn't quite their house, but looked exactly like it. A place where everything was the same but slightly wrong, where the family lived the same life, but with small differences that grew larger the longer you stayed. As the evening continued, Peppa began to notice more small changes. The pictures on the walls showed the family, but their expressions were subtly different. The furniture sat in the same positions, but the shadows they cast didn't match the light sources in the room. The episode ended with the family gathering for dinner, everything appearing normal once again. But as they sat around the table, viewers would notice that each family member cast two shadows, and in the background, barely visible, stood another family that looked exactly like them, watching from what might have been another room, or perhaps another world entirely.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George discovered something strange in their toy box. The toys had arranged themselves in a perfect circle overnight, something that had never happened before. Peppa giggled nervously as she picked up her favorite teddy bear, but its button eyes seemed different somehow, darker and more knowing. That evening, as the family settled down for bedtime, the children noticed their bedroom felt colder than usual. The familiar drawings on the walls appeared to shift slightly when they weren't looking directly at them. George's dinosaur toy, usually green and cheerful, now seemed to watch them with an unsettling intensity. At exactly midnight, Peppa woke to the sound of whispers, not the kind of whispers that come from people, but something else entirely. The toys were moving on their own, rotating slowly in their circle on the bedroom floor. The train set began to chug along its tracks without anyone winding it up, making a grinding noise that sounded almost like laughter. George sat up in his bed, but when he turned to look at Peppa, his eyes were completely black, like empty holes in his face. He spoke, but his voice was deeper than it should be, older and colder. He told Peppa about the other children who had lived in this room before them, children who had played the same games and slept in the same beds. Peppa tried to call for Mummy and Daddy, but no sound came from her throat. The bedroom door had vanished, replaced by a solid wall covered in drawings that moved and writhed like living things. Through the window, instead of their familiar garden, she could see an endless dark forest where shadowy figures moved between the trees. The ceiling began to lower slowly, covered with hundreds of blinking eyes that watched every movement. The walls started to breathe like living creatures, expanding and contracting with wet, organic sounds. The toys reached out with impossibly long arms, inviting Peppa to join their eternal playtime. As the room transformed around them, Peppa realized this wasn't their bedroom anymore. It was a place between dreams and nightmares, where lost children played games that never ended. The last thing she remembered was the sound of hollow laughter echoing from somewhere far away. When morning came, Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig found the room exactly as it should be. The toys were neatly arranged. The drawings on the walls showed happy elephants and boats, and everything looked perfectly normal. But Peppa and George were different now. They smiled too widely, and their eyes held secrets that children should never know. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows that moved independently of the clouds outside. As she walked downstairs for breakfast, she noticed that all the family photos on the wall had changed. In every picture, the smiles were just a little too wide, the eyes a little too bright, and everyone was looking directly at her. Mummy Pig was in the kitchen making breakfast, but when she turned around, her face was exactly the same as always, yet somehow completely wrong. Her smile stretched from ear to ear, never wavering, never blinking. "Good morning, Peppa," she said in her usual voice, but the words seemed to echo from somewhere far away. "Would you like some breakfast, dear?" The pancakes on the plate were perfectly round, perfectly golden, and they never seemed to get cold. George was already at the table playing with his toy dinosaur, but the dinosaur's roar sounded different today. Instead of the cheerful grrr it usually made, it produced a low, haunting sound that seemed to come from deep underground. George himself sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on something behind Peppa that she couldn't see. When she turned around, there was nothing there, but she could feel something watching her. Daddy Pig came down the stairs, his heavy footsteps echoing through the house in a rhythm that didn't quite match his movement. "Time for school, Peppa," he announced cheerfully, but his voice had a hollow quality, as if it was coming from inside a deep well. His glasses reflected not the kitchen around them, but something else entirely. A place with twisted trees and a sky the color of old blood. The walk to school felt longer than usual. The familiar houses along the way looked the same, but their windows were all dark, and behind each one, Peppa could see the faint outline of figures watching her pass. The other children were walking to school too, but they all moved in perfect synchronization, their steps matching exactly, their heads turning to look at her at precisely the same moment. At school, Madame Gazelle greeted the children with her usual warm smile, but today her eyes were completely black, like deep pools of water at night. "Today, children, we're going to learn about shadows," she announced. "Did you know that shadows can exist without the things that cast them?" As she spoke, the shadows in the classroom began to move on their own, stretching and twisting across the walls like living things. During playtime, Peppa noticed that the playground equipment cast shadows that didn't match their shapes. The slide's shadow looked like a giant mouth. The swing's shadows resembled reaching hands, and the roundabout's shadow formed a perfect spiral that seemed to pull your eyes deeper and deeper into its center. The other children played as normal, but their laughter sounded like it was coming from underwater. When Peppa looked in the bathroom mirror during lunch, her reflection was delayed by just a fraction of a second. She would move her hand, and a moment later, her reflection would follow. But sometimes, Her reflection would move first, showing her what she was about to do before she decided to do it. The reflection's smile was always just a little wider than her own. The afternoon brought art class, where they were supposed to draw their families. But no matter what Peppa tried to draw, the crayons would only make pictures of the same thing. A house with too many windows, all of them dark, and in each window, the silhouette of someone waving. The other children's drawings were identical to hers, down to the smallest detail, even though they were all drawing with different colored crayons. As the school day ended, Peppa realized that the sun hadn't moved in the sky at all. It hung in exactly the same position it had been in that morning, casting the same strange shadows that moved independently of their sources. The walk home felt like walking through a dream where everything was familiar, but nothing was quite right. Back at home, the family gathered for dinner, but the food on their plates kept changing when no one was looking directly at it. One moment it would be spaghetti, the next it would be fish fingers, then back to spaghetti again. Everyone ate with the same mechanical movements, chewing in perfect unison, their eyes never leaving Peppa's face. That night, as Peppa lay in her bed, she could hear whispers coming from the walls themselves. They spoke in voices she almost recognized, saying words she almost understood, telling her secrets about the world that she wasn't sure she wanted to know. The whispers grew louder and more insistent as the night wore on, until finally she realized they weren't coming from the walls at all. They were coming from inside her own head, and they had always been there, waiting for her to finally listen. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sunlight streaming through their window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across the yellow walls. Peppa looked at herself in the mirror and noticed something odd. Her reflection seemed to move just a fraction of a second after she did. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was preparing breakfast in the kitchen. Her usual cheerful humming had a hollow echo to it, and when she turned to greet the children, her eyes appeared darker than normal. George bounced down the stairs, clutching his favorite dinosaur toy, but the plastic eyes of the dinosaur seemed to follow every movement in the room. Outside, the neighborhood looked exactly the same as always, yet something felt fundamentally different. The houses had the same bright colors, but their windows looked like empty eye sockets staring back at them. When Susie Sheep arrived to play, her movements seemed slightly jerky, and her laughter echoed in ways that made the air feel thick and uncomfortable. More friends gathered: Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, and Candy Cat. Pedro's eyes never seemed to blink. Rebecca's ears twitched at sounds no one else could hear, and Candy Cat purred continuously, even when she wasn't speaking. The children decided to play hide-and-seek inside Peppa's house, but the hallways seemed longer than they remembered. Peppa began counting, her voice creating multiple echoes that seemed to come from different directions. 1, 2, 3. Each number hung in the air longer than it should have. The counting continued, but now there were voices counting along with her. Voices that sounded exactly like hers but came from somewhere else entirely. As evening approached, the family gathered in their living room. The familiar green walls and purple furniture looked the same, but shadows gathered in corners where there had never been shadows before. When they spoke, their voices seemed to come from slightly behind them, as if someone else was speaking their words just a moment after they thought them. That night, as Peppa and George lay in their beds, they could hear George's rhythmic breathing. But when Peppa looked over at her brother, she saw that his eyes were glowing softly in the darkness, and his breathing continued, even though his mouth wasn't moving. She closed her eyes tightly, trying to sleep, but she could feel that something fundamental had changed in their world. Everything looked the same, everyone acted the same, but nothing was quite right anymore. The colors were the same bright yellows and pinks, the voices were the same cheerful tones, but underneath it all was the growing realization that this might not be their real home at all. Peppa wondered if this strange, slightly wrong version of her life was now permanent, or if somewhere out there, the real world was still waiting for them to find their way back. As she drifted off to sleep, She wondered what tomorrow would bring in this place that looked like home but felt like something else entirely.